Good evening. 25 years ago in Rwanda, my family lived in Kigali, not too far from the UN headquarters where General Dallaire was in command. Of course, then, I didn't know him. On April 7, 1994, our house guard is banging the door, making a commotion to wake us up, asking us to run for our lives and seek shelter. He informs my parents that my uncle had been killed in cold blood along with his 3 children and his wife. I was 10 years old then, shaken and terrified. We left our home in search for shelter, seeking for help from our neighbors, institutions that had been known to be safe haven in Rwanda at the time. No one would take us. We were Tutsis condemned to die. After 7 long days of running and hiding, a good Samaritan took me and my brother in and hid us. But my father, my grandmother, and at least 1 million other Tutsis were not so lucky. They were victims of a genocide that was predictable, that was preventable. I, as a 10-year-old child, was a witness to some of the most gruesome sight of violence. I saw things that the children should never see. I heard sounds that a child should never have to hear. I smelled things that no child should ever have to smell. And after 100 long days, the genocide was over, and the Rwandan survivors came out, and we started to wonder, what happened here? How is it possible that our neighbors, our friends, and the world could look away when our loved ones were being slaughtered? And in that journey, we learned about General Dallaire and a few hundreds of UN soldiers who were under his command, those who laid it all on the line. Not only they disobeyed lawful orders to stay back and save as many lives, they risked their health, their lives, and their careers. And in thinking and learning about that, it restored a little bit of hope. In the shadows of the darkness of a genocide, there is still a glimmer of hope, where brave soldiers, people in their place, make choices to stand up and really give meaning to what it is that is our shared humanity. So tonight, sir, I simply want to share one simple thought. Just by deciding to refuse to abandon us, you and your troops help us as survivors restore that little piece of humanity, a shared humanity. And for this, there are no words to express our gratitude. It is one thing to say that everyone matters in the comfort of a beautiful hall like this, in the middle of Toronto. It is quite another to act like it in the middle of a genocide. Tonight, sir, we honor your courage in discharging your duty. Not only a duty to one nation or one institution, but a duty to humankind, which you set above all else in everything you have done even since. So thank you, we love you, et nous n'oublions jamais. Merci.
we were to be an easy peacekeeping mission that could be done on the cheap. We started with nothing. A few pieces of paper, pencil, not even enough cash to pay for the phone bills back to New York, and that's pretty well the resources we got. Although you're given your orders and the situation is complex and so on, you just hope that all that has fallen into place and that the human factor, which becomes what we call often the fog of war, doesn't mess it up.
Heavy fighting has broken out around the capital of Rwanda hours after the president died in a plane crash.
The plane was shot down by a rocket near the Kigali airport.
That means that the government has collapsed. It's not at all clear who's in charge of Rwanda at the moment.
The massacres by government militia has caused millions of Rwandans to be displaced.
Western nations are racing to remove their nationals from the country and its tribal warfare.
I was here on the ground with him, seeing what his soldiers were doing, seeing the appalling conditions that they were working under, and you would see that he was trying to carry on talking to everybody with one aim in mind, which was to save the lives of Rwandans within the realms of the possible.
A journalist once asked me, he said, "What in the hell are you doing here? I mean, why are you staying?" And I blurted out, I said, if I can save one Rwandan, then it's worth it. And the journalist said, "Yeah, but there are tens of thousands being slaughtered every day." And I said, then maybe if I can be a witness, maybe I'll have a chance to tell everything that we were seeing. If I've been able to literally shake hands with the devil, it only seems absolutely logical that there's another entity. Because there is that extreme of evil, there is the other extreme of the purest of good.
I would first like to say that in acknowledging the land that we are on, I speak to you as Gasone, grandmother of many nations of the blood tribe of Alberta. And I acknowledge that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty with the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The other Indigenous nations and peoples and all of us newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Friends and everyone, and Adam Gopnik, who honored us last night with a compelling and delightful LaFontaine Baldwin lecture. I'm so glad to welcome you here to join us for 6 Degrees and for this 4th Adrienne Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship. I'm delighted that you are here to welcome Roméo Dallaire, soldier, general, senator, and tireless advocate for the rights of all human beings. You know, in 1 month, on October 7th, it will be 20 years since I was appointed Governor-General of Canada by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The Governor-General, apart from the constitutional functions, is the Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Forces. I was continually exposed to the professional and public service that the armed forces are. I am the first Canadian Colonel-in-Chief of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and I am very proud of the fact that John Ralston Saul and I spent 6 Christmases with our troops in the Persian Gulf twice, in Afghanistan twice, and in the Balkans twice. A well-coordinated and effective body of armed forces is one of the unsung and unheralded features of our life as citizens in Canada. I admire how our soldiers are trained to act and to think and organize before they act, always knowing that it is human life that is at stake. The men and women who enter our armed forces are trained to fight. They are also trained to protect human life. I met Roméo Dallaire first as a result of the aftermath of what he had gone through in Rwanda. The chief of the defense staff when I became Governor General was General Maurice Barry, who had been Roméo's superior and took a deep personal interest in him. In the time that I was Governor General, I gave him the Order of Canada in 2002, the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction for Shake Hands with the Devil in 2004, and I signed the papers that made him a senator in 2005. Tonight, I'm deeply honored that he accepts this Global Citizenship Prize. I learned from my contact with Roméo Dallaire the truth of what Winston Churchill said. Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because it is the quality that guarantees all the others. I knew I had met a courageous man, not on the field or doing something daring, but when he came down the table to me at a mess dinner in Quebec City to whisper, "I hope you do not mind if I have to leave, Madame. I cannot go on." I turned and looked into his face and saw his eyes filled with tears. That was 6 years after what had happened in Rwanda. Over the period that I saw him intermittently in Ottawa during my mandate, I always worried about him. His intense humanity, his generosity, and his openness about his condition were something that touched me deeply. Here was a brilliantly qualified soldier from a wonderful regiment, the Royal Band Deuxième, who had tried to do his best within the training that he had received, who had been involved in truly one of the most horrible messes of modern times. In a soldier's language, that would not be called a horrible mess. Having been brought up as a Pearson-era person who is so proud as a Canadian of the invention of peacekeeping, I knew that what Roméo Dallaire had been faced with in 1994 was not a peacekeeping mission. What he was faced with was aggression, violence, murder, and genocide. And he paid the cost of that in his own life, with his own soul. When it was known that he was suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome with the published incidents of attempted suicide, I admired his courage even more, and we talked about it. We talked about how he had tried to wade into the frozen Ottawa River and was rescued. But then writing books, continuing to advocate that no human is more human than any other, has been his mission. This is a man of intense personal courage and emotional energy beyond the stricken condition in which he had found himself. He's always talked so honestly with me about wanting to do himself in, about his suicidal thoughts, and I certainly always worried about him, but I was pleased that he was able to take on the work of being a senator, of being one of our legislators. He's meant for public life. He's meant for public life because he has that perfect combination of a leader in public life: compassion and an ethical standard. He confirmed his humanitarian activities actively involved by taking the cause of child soldiers, and he continues to advocate for peace in the world. In 2007, he founded the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative to help prevent the recruitment and use of child soldiers. It's based in Dalhousie. He's a distinguished senior fellow at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, commonly called MIGS. And Elage, who spoke at the beginning, is also at that institute. He's co-director of one of its projects, which is called the Will to Intervene Project, which recently published a policy recommendation report mobilizing the will to intervene, leadership and action to prevent mass atrocities. It's wonderful to see that his work is being recognized with the establishment of the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security within the Canadian Defence Academy. His life and his actions make all of us Canadians proud because he shows us that when we can come out of the depths of suffering and witnessing suffering, we can also live with our own failure at the time to help others and to continue to show an example of humanity in a world which so often tries to destroy it. Now at 73, he's still thinking of new things to do and new ways of helping. It's been said that the greatest human beings who understand what it is like to live in a world with others never avert their eyes from other people's suffering. Roméo Dallaire has shown us how it is to live with eyes and heart open, looking at everything, feeling everything, bearing witness, and paying the price for that. I am so pleased to honor Roméo Dallaire. Wonderful. There, they won't do that. Are the chairs coming out? Not now?
No.
Not yet?
Give my speech.
Oh, he has to give a speech. I didn't realize he had to give a speech. I thought we would get talking right away.
Votre Excellence, Madame Adrienne Clarkson, and John Wilson-Saul, first thing is I would like to thank you for having received me in your home recently and so warmly received Marie-Claude also. And so thank you enormously for that. I want to thank also the board and the members, and particularly Madame Clarkson, for selecting me as the 6 degrees global citizen, I suppose, is a very massive term, but I humbly accept that magnificent award and acronym, and thank you so much for that. But I want to thank two other people that set me on a path of service and have been a reference. And I rarely mention them, and I wish to do it tonight. My dad's name was Roméo Dallaire. And at 14, he was working in the open pit mines of the asbestos mines in Thetford in Quebec. And he lost his parents very early, went out west, and then joined the army in 1929. And served 6 years overseas in World War II and found a magnificent woman who was a nurse, a Dutch nurse, and they married, and I appeared. I hope as a prize after the war and the suffering. And we came to Canada. I was 6 months old on a Red Cross ship through Pier 21 and on a Red Cross train to Quebec City where my dad was posted, and we lived there and in Montreal, in East End Montreal, amongst all the oil refineries with 500 other veteran families. My dad was an NCO, he's a staff sergeant, mechanic. Night before I left for military college in 1964, we walked the streets and they were as bright as day because all the oil refineries are burning all their gases and fumes, and it smelled terrible. That's where they put our veterans in those days. And so he told me three things. He said, if you want to make a career, he said, I would like to tell you 3 points to maybe consider and remember. The first one, he said, is you'll never be a millionaire. And he had to work extra work because the salary couldn't sustain a family of 5. But he said, you're going to have a very interesting career. And that was the understatement for many years afterwards. The second thing he said, you're not going to go anywhere in the military with a name like Dallaire. And so you better change it to Dallaires because there's no place right now for French Canadians in the higher ranks. And at the time, there were over 80 generals and admirals, and there were only 2 French Canadians. And one of them was from Ontario, in fact. And in 1968, of course, that changed with the B&B. The third thing he told me, which remained a reference for me in my commands and with the troops that I served with, and who served with me so loyally. He said, you're entering a service, and don't ever expect anyone to say thank you. For you didn't enter for the thank yous. You entered because you wanted to serve. And that was the guide for the rest of my life and still is. To serve, if we can, to others. To build within humanity a reference, maybe that you could be of use in helping it advance, to keep it progressing. I have often wondered since the catastrophe of Rwanda whether or not there is amongst us too many who think that humanity is not on a path of thriving, but is in fact on a path of survival. And if you have, as a sort of backdrop to your philosophy of life, that we're a species that's hopefully going to survive, it seems to me that you're already in such a pejorative scenario that how can you actually help humanity thrive? How can you actually go beyond what you are in order to participate in the communion between humanity and the planet that will guarantee that it will thrive, and that human beings are not Darwinian. Human beings seek serenity. They seek serenity for themselves, for their families. And it is my belief, even after what I have witnessed, that one day we will not revert to slaughtering each other because of our differences and the frictions of our differences, but we will actually resolve them without the use of force, without the abuse. It may take a couple centuries, but so what? We've been around for how many millennia? What if over the next couple of centuries we're actually able to move human rights, to move the grander scale of things like the environment, like the ability for us to recognize that we are all equal, that we are all, in fact, the same, that there is not one of us that is more human than the other, and in so doing, build a world where we don't tolerate the differences, the nuances, but in fact we respect each other. And in so doing, we treat each other as equals. Are we actually treating humanity and all humans as equals? During the genocide, when I was maneuvering between the lines through no man's land, negotiating the movement of people from one ethnic group behind the lines of the other and vice versa, driving down the road, all of a sudden a little boy appeared a couple hundred meters ahead. And there wasn't supposed to be no one in that area because the war had already gone through there a number of times and the two armies had pulled back. But the extremists were using young children to stop humanitarian convoys by putting them on the road, and if the kids didn't stay there, they simply killed them, and if the kids did stay there, the convoys would stop. They'd ambush the convoys and steal the food and water and medical supplies and the like. And that sustained the killing for 100 days. So I was sort of expecting maybe an ambush, and I had a couple soldiers with me, and we stopped and we jumped out. No ambush. We went to the huts that were close at hand, and all we saw were people who had been killed weeks beforehand. And as we're trying to find someone to take care of this little boy, we lost the boy. And so we doubled back, and we found him in a hut where there were two adults, male, female, a couple children, and they were half-eaten by dogs and rats. And he was sitting there as if he was at home. So I took him and I picked him up and I brought him in front of my vehicle and I looked at him. His stomach was bloated. He was dirty. He was mangy. He smelled. There were flies all around him. He was in rags. But then I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in the eyes of that little 7-year-old boy was exactly what I saw in the eyes of my 7-year-old son that I had left in Quebec City when I went to Africa. They were the eyes of a human child, and they were exactly the same. That little boy, in the midst of that horror, was just as human and right to life as my son in Quebec. I know where my son is. What happened to that little boy? What happens to the thousands of children that are surviving or in fact being abused and dying in adult-run wars where the children are the primary weapon of those wars, where 40% more are girls who are abused in all fashions? What are happening to them? And how is it possible that with all the legal and all the activities that we try to bring forward to the authorities of the world and the different organizations from the UN and onward, that we simply don't seem to be able to break the code, that when human beings are massively abused in their human rights, that we have a responsibility to protect, to intervene, and even be prepared to pay in our own blood to protect others. How is it that the political elites of the world simply cannot come to grips with that ultimate responsibility, that essentially the universality of human beings can be a force to ensure that globally we are united in peace and security? How can we move that yardstick forward? In 2009, I'm going to go a little farther than CNN history, which is last week. In 2009, it was the 250th anniversary of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. A couple years before that, I started a campaign to try to see what we would do to commemorate the incredible suffering of the people at that time. I live now in a village that was burnt down during that war. Of all, not only the soldiers, the French and the British soldiers, but of the Canadiens and the militias that fought, of the First Nations that fought, of the families that ultimately died of starvation and cold that winter. What are we planning to do to commemorate that? And over 2 years, not one politician in this country, from municipal upward to the Prime Minister, had the guts to say, we're not celebrating that moment, so significant in this nation's development and future. We want to commemorate and thank and be aware of those who are still buried around Quebec City and the price they paid. Not one could handle that task. And so it was rather surprising that when troops were coming back from Yugoslavia, and they would tell me, we've been trying to sort this place out, and they keep bringing back wars of 400 years ago or 450 years ago, and they still have animosity, and they're prepared to kill each other, and they did, and they raped, and they destroyed for something that happened so long ago. How is it possible, my soldiers would say, that people can still act on those things in this era? And so I told them the story of our inability, 250 years later, to even commemorate a most significant moment where sacrifices were paid and the nation was moving towards, in fact, a country to which we are now one of the most 11 most powerful, and we are a country of enormous stability, and hopefully will still remain open to all to come and join in the experiment of this great nation made of such enormous numbers of foreign peoples of all lands now coming to build the potential of Canada in the world. Where, however, are we getting the guidance for that? And how are we preparing for such a possible role of being a beacon in the world, of actually trying to achieve our potential, our real potential globally in the world, and be an instrument of building humanity stronger and building a humanity that is going to thrive? Well, I'm going to go back into history again. And this is farther than sometimes CBC even. It is 2007. I'm in caucus, and every Wednesday morning, the senators and MPs meet by party to plan strategy. Well, I spent 11 years learning strategy, and I can tell you nobody's planning strategy in those mornings. I can also tell you that they got their hands full handling the tactics of the next day, what's in the Globe and Mail. And so in those mornings, you can address the whole of the party, and if you're in power, you got the Prime Minister and so on. And you're given 3 minutes. And so in 2007, I had my 3 minutes, and I got up and I said, what's special about the number 2017? What's special about the year 2017? No answer. I said the year 2017 is going to be the 150th anniversary of one of the most stable democracies in the world. There's 194 countries, and although the Confederation needs some serious tweaking, it is still the most stable democracy in the world. I said it's also going to be the 100th anniversary when the youth of this nation, 16 and 17-year-olds, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, in the tens of thousands crossed that pond, fought, bled, died in a battle that moved us from being a colonial cousin to a nation state, paid in blood that price at Vimy Ridge. So I said, what's the plan? What is going to culminate in 2017? But more important, in this time of enormous ambiguity and complexity, as the world is bouncing from one seemingly crisis to another, how are we getting ahead of the game? And what is going to be our role? How are we going to achieve the extraordinary potential that we have to offer to guide our youth into the future and achieve what we hope a leadership role in assisting nations continue to advance within human rights and democracies and safety and serenity? There was no answer. I stood up a second time. I didn't abuse the privilege. 5 years later, in 2012, and put through the same questions and got exactly the same answer, nothing. And so 2017 came, and what did we do? We didn't even build hockey rinks this time. We ate a lot of cake. But what did we leave? What did the leadership elite of this nation, from all venues, industrial, business, academia, political, humanitarian, NGO, what did the political elite of this nation do to give us the focus of moving this extraordinary nation, this extraordinary country, into the leadership role that it will be held accountable for in history, of assisting in advancing humanity and helping it thrive by the extraordinary capabilities that our people have and our country has. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when the elite cannot see the grander strategic focus and what they have in their hands to be able to influence the world globally, particularly in this time of the communications revolution, technology revolutions, it is not surprise that we're barely able to handle a lot of little tactical nuances that is influencing us so much, and avoid trying to really give the focus of our nation and the youth of where we want to bring it. And that brings me to a conclusion. I call those who are under 25 the generation without borders, because that group now is already global. When they're on their communication systems, they can nearly Skype anybody in the world, and soon we will be. They can see real-time human beings in other places. They can coalesce rapidly. They can build rapidly coalitions in order to influence. They also have another dimension to them that we are underestimating. It is that they hold the balance of power in this nation because their 2.9 million votes have never been used. And if they ever use it, if they ever coalesce, if they ever realize that we should be holding them accountable for what the future is instead of simply being told that we're not doing it well, but hold them accountable to join in and to change the nature, possibly of the political structures of our nation in one election. If we do not hold them accountable to that, then they will slowly, too slowly, start to realize that they do, maybe, and they will, maybe, be able to influence this nation and what it stands for, and they will push the generations ahead of it aside, and they will move us to where we should be. Global citizens, led by a generation without borders, that can communicate with human beings alive and breathing in every part of this planet. And so that is my hope. I hope they become the most activist generation that this nation has ever seen, and that they do become part, really part, of the decision of this nation into the future. Thank you very much.
Now we get to talk together. That was lovely, wonderful. So we pick it up there about.
Okay.
Please.
My prize.
Yes.
Thank you. And my gin.
Don't laugh. I once interviewed a very famous English politician in England, and he was getting slower and slower and slower in his replies. And he had left power and become a lord. He had been in the cabinet. He had Chancellor of the Exchequer, actually. And as he became slower and slower and slower, I realized that something was wrong. And at the end of it, I mean, it ended on nothing. It was horrible. Somebody said to me, "That wasn't water. He was drinking vodka." And it was as much as that. Don't worry, this is water. But I want to pick up on what you said about the generation that is the global generation that is able to communicate, to Skype, to be together with everybody in the world. And you and I share something, which is that we would like to see the voting age lowered to 16. Mm-hmm. And I have my reasons for that. That is, I feel that energy has to be harnessed then, even though I know the people who are 16 now probably have a life expectancy of 92 years. But I think the sooner we get going, the better. And what do you feel about it? I always felt, going around to schools when I was Governor General, that the kids who were 14, 15, 16 were the best and the brightest and the most concerned about the planet. They were forming clubs about the environment. They were caring about animals becoming extinct, all sorts of things. And university students just didn't have that interest, or they just weren't the same.
I believe it because we educate them on social responsibility. We educate them we inform them of our institutions. We speak to them about the nature of this country and its democracy and the participating dimension of us as individual citizens to the nation. And they're 15 and 16, as you say, but they can't vote till they're 18.
Yeah.
So there is no reinforcement of, in fact, that duty that they have as a citizen. And so I don't think we should do like Australia and make it a law that everybody must vote, because I'm not sure that is indicative of a nation that's really mature in regards to its social responsibility to itself and to its nation. But I do see an absolute disconnect between teaching them how important it is and not giving them the opportunity to exercise it. And if we're worried about 16 and 17-year-olds who are going to change the face of politics, then so be it. Mm-hmm. Let's worry about it. And let's maybe get some of that attention out of the stratosphere of the elders and down to where their future is now in their face. Yogi Berra, great American philosopher, he said, over 60 years ago, he said, the future ain't what it used to be. And the future then was changing too fast for him, and it was nothing compared to what's going on now. Yeah. When I graduated from military college, there was this rather elderly colonel. He was about 45. And he said, well, young man, he said, what do you think you're going to have as a career? And to me, that meant 20 years down the road. Well, I did have 20 years of apprenticeship to build what hopefully could be useful in society and influence it. The youth today don't have 20 years. Things are shifting so fast in so many arenas that they're lucky is what they're learning when they enter university is still pertinent when they get out. Mm-hmm. Because the future is 5 or 6 years down the road. So we must engage them not in tokenism, but we must engage them with a sense of accountability to be part of the decision of this nation into its future, because it's their future. And when I'm sort of taken on by that, I tell them, Dallaire spoke about the genocide. The slaughter of that nearly 1 million people was done by under 18 militia that were indoctrinated, slowly indoctrinated and trained to kill by machete and to turn human beings into cockroaches. And it was the youth that slaughtered, with the adults guiding them. And so we got them, in one sense, doing massive abuses of human rights and being a sword like that. We got them being used to fight adult wars. And by the by, we tended to do that in the past too. Because the youth of our nation, they're the ones who go overseas and fight. They're the ones who stand in the front lines. And so why are they not in the front lines of the decision-making processes? And so, as the forum discussed today, there's got to be a significant shift where youth are not inexperienced, immature, and don't really know what they're talking about. They've got to be consulted and nurtured and influenced, maybe focused, but given them an opportunity to show what they can, in fact, bring to us, and not take what we give them and abdicate their responsibilities to the nation for too many years.
You spoke about your time in government, and it wasn't in the most positive terms. Was it disillusioning for you to be a senator after having been such an effective general and a person who was able to change things by writing your books and so on? The Americans, their generals spend a lot of time on their hill. And they are fairly close to the political structure of the nation. We've had governments that have refused to see generals on the hill. We've had governments that have refused to see generals in uniform in Ottawa. And so there have only been a few generals ever in both in the House of Commons or in the Senate. And there's only been a couple after World War II, but in the last years only 2, 3. And so
I was a different animal walking into the great chamber. But what I felt is that there was a hunger for information, and that my colleagues wanted to know what we thought. And we're interested in what the security side of the nation is, and how it's evolving, and how we are prepared, and how we can hopefully provide military advice, security advice to the political elite, to political authorities. And so I felt that the 9.5, nearly 10 years there, very rewarding, because it is an absolutely essential institution of our system of governance. The stuff that comes out of the House of Commons that represents us is so politically focused that it doesn't pass the test of actually meeting the full requirement of the nation. And I've met people like Frank Mahovlich, I mean, a
hockey player, yes.
And so on. He was 12 years in the Senate on a number of committees, traveled the whole country, gained enormous depth on what Canada is and people are and so on, and was a wise counsel to the legislation that was coming in, and provided insights into what maybe amendments should be brought to ensure that the idea of that legislation didn't get warped by some political advantage, but on the contrary, was meeting the higher plane of the needs of the nation. And so the Senate, unelected, is critical to ensuring, to me, a stable system of governance that has a balance in it between those who represent the people and are caught up in the political construct, and those who can take a step back and influence from inside the actual product of governance of our nation.
But you as a person, you as a human being, and you in the life that you have led, the fact is that you have a very interesting relationship to authority. For one thing, you went into a position of authority. You don't become a general in anybody's armed forces without knowing how to handle authority. But you also knew how to disobey authority. You decided to disobey authority when you were faced with a situation where other people would say, well, I can't go beyond my competence and beyond what I've been ordered to do, because a soldier, above all, follows orders, right? That's what you're trained to do as a cadet. That's what you're trained to do right the way through. But you disobeyed. So what is your relationship to power and a power structure then? And why did you disobey? And what are the conditions for disobeying?
I get the feeling you're preparing my court-martial. In absentia, though, well, I can tell you that. When the Secretary General called me and told me that my force was going to be wiped out, and we knew the extremist battalions were maneuvering to take out my headquarters, because I had a whole bunch of elite Tutsis in there, and they wanted at them. And I had only, at the time, about 50 soldiers protecting me, and we had about 3 minutes worth of ammunition to cover it. But when he told me that the
3 minutes, that's all you had left, you mean?
Of ammunition. Because we didn't have ammunition. Anyways, he said the world cannot handle 400 total force that was there, blue berets being slaughtered. It can handle 10,000 Rwandans being slaughtered a day, but not 400 blue berets, so you pull out. The answer came instinctively. And I think that's one of the great rewards of what this nation has inculcated in me, is that it wasn't military tactics, wasn't the years of training as a soldier and so on. The answer came instinctively because it came from my schooling, the church, my communities, the society, that put something in my gut that made me say no. And why I said no was because although the order was legal, and I then became a rogue commander, the order was immoral. Because we had, at the time, about 32,000 Rwandans in 4 sites. And one nation had pulled its force out before we were able to replace it with a few, and 4,000 people, just under 4,000, were slaughtered in less than 2 hours. And so I knew that if we pulled out, those 32,000 there would have been slaughtered. And so I considered it to be immoral, but it was an instinctive answer. He wasn't the guy who liked to get an answer no. He repeated it. I said no again. His chief of staff called back and said, "You realize you've become a rogue commander?" And I said yes, and I hung up. However, there was an ethical problem. The ethical problem was that my troops could not follow a rogue commander. And so I had to go and ensure that each of them decided to stay with me, knowing full well that I was a rogue commander, and they would be held accountable to that. But I considered no reward for that decision because it came from this society. It came from this nation. It was inculcated in me, and it spontaneously expressed itself, and I still say it was right. So that's how it happened.
Well, it was right. It may not have been legal in the terms of that, but it was right. And so few people can make those decisions. It's existential. It's the immediacy of it, and of course, you know, your actions brought consequences on yourself. You were not able to help those 800,000 people, or nearly 1 million people who were slaughtered. Do you feel anger or resentment in a direct way with the people who were not willing to help? President Clinton, Boutros Ghali, heads of other European nations. Do you feel resentment to them? Do you think that they are to blame for this thing that happened, which was hideous?
Absolutely. And Ad Mitterrand and a few others. They took decisions, and those decisions had consequences. If you lead a world power, if you lead a nation that has the capability of preventing this, and you decide not to, then you are to be held accountable in history. And so as an example, Bill Clinton, who has never met me, maybe avoids me, I'm not sure, but 4 years after the genocide, he went to Rwanda, and he stayed at the airport. His aircraft was still there, and he said that he was sorry that what had happened, that they had not reacted. It happened so fast, and we weren't able to react. And he said, I really didn't know it was this bad. However, when you go into the entrails of that decision process, you find out that Mogadishu and the killing of the 19 Rangers in Mogadishu happened about 5 months before the genocide. And they dragged the bodies of a couple of soldiers through the streets. And Bill Clinton brought in March of '94, a presidential directive number 25 that said the United States will not intervene in any humanitarian catastrophe or humanitarian conflict unless it's in its self-interest. That was a directive. And so when the genocide happened, the information didn't make it up to him because they had orders not to tell him. Mm-hmm. And so I met people who tried to get the information up, but never took it. And so, yes, I hold them absolutely accountable. And when I went in front of Congress, the Congressional Committee on Foreign Relations, I held the Black Caucus directly responsible who were calling themselves at the time very strongly African Americans, and they did nothing to influence the government at the time. Nothing, in no way, shape, or form to participate in trying to prevent that. And lastly, yes, Boutros Ghali, because he was Secretary General and he was such a centralist and nobody could get any information to the Security Council unless it went through him, and he seemed to be never there at the time. I hold him very much accountable for his leadership there. But there's one gang that I think have borne too much the brunt in a too facile way. I made mistakes in the field, and I hold myself accountable for those mistakes because I was in command. The Secretariat made mistakes. Security Council made mistakes, even though some of the members did try to do something. But where the real guilt should be is in every nation that had any capability of providing the UN assets that I could use to stop the genocide, who refused to give the UN any of those assets. So it's not only the UN, it's the member states of the UN who deliberately refused to provide the UN the assets that I needed in the field. Except for the couple countries that the soldiers stayed with me, and 4 African nations who were prepared to come in, but didn't have the strategic lift, didn't have the equipment. And when I was trying to get the strategic lift, that was one thing. But when I tried to get them the equipment to be able to come and use it, I was being told that, no, we don't want to give them that because they'll simply keep it and then their presidential guard will conduct a coup and then the whole country will go upside down. And so we were treating them as grade 9 students. So the insult of those who were prepared, Africans prepared, to even spill blood to come and protect other Africans, were treated as children by the, I would say, the leading powers of the world. They're the ones who should be held accountable and should, in history, be recognized for that.
What will their punishment be? Ever?
Well, I hope they rot in hell, but apart from there... And I know hell exists. I know hell exists because I met the devil. It wasn't a sort of a cute title that I put, Shake Hands with the Devil. Because I still remember very clearly the day when I met with the 3 leaders of the militia of the youth, who were running the youths who were doing the slaughtering. And I remember taking my pistol and putting it on the table because I had a near instinct of just blowing them away. But if I did that, they'd be replaced. And I met with them and I shook hands with them. And they had, particularly the one in the middle, the leading one, he had blood on his shirt. And when I shook the hand of that individual in particular, it wasn't a human hand. It wasn't a tactile connection that one would have even with somebody with a cold hand or a hot hand or a sweaty hand. It was something different. And his eyes reflected an evil that was absolutely undescribable in humanity. And to me, Catholic boy, looking at that, that was the devil in a sort of human body. And so I knew that the devil existed. And I deducted, and it took a number of years after, that if the devil and evil exists, then good does exist. But the problem with good is that it doesn't seem to have an ability to coalesce to prevent evil. It might react to it, it might let it run its course and then throw some cash at it, but it just doesn't seem to be able to prevent it from taking over. And that's, I guess, something we live with.
Do you still believe in God?
That's why I told you, said it took a few years, because I totally did not believe in God, because I said, how could he have left my troops, myself, and those Rwandans to be slaughtered and not intervene? Not intervene in any way, shape, or form to permit that from happening and to stop it. But only later on did I realize that evil at times does win, and God has his hands full trying to prevent them from taking over. And so Rwanda, which is a paradise on earth, with a magnificent society, with people who have a depth of human culture that is so much deeper than ours. We are too materialistic. I used to stop on occasion in a village where the elders would be sitting under a tree or something, and I'd stop and I'd go for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and I'd sit amongst them. They'd sort of nod, and we never said a word. And it was as if we were communicating. And this sort of sense of their strength, their being, their sensitivity was infectious. And I'd leave there, and I'd leave there reinforced. That African culture is so deep and so profound in its sense of humanity, as well as it can also become exceptionally ruthless. And so to come back to my militia leaders, when I was telling them and berating them on how they could let these kids do the slaughtering and stopping and so on, and how dare you to destroy these people and act like this, one of them turned to me and he said, "Who do you think you are?" He said, "How many black Africans were in World War II slaughtering the Jews? How dare you tell us that we're savages? How dare you tell us we're savages when King Leopold was wiping out villages with his forces, all men, women, and children, in order to encourager les autres to produce more rubber so that it could be sold to us to put on our trucks to be able to fight World War II. And they started the concept of slaughter. And it wasn't instinctive in the African culture. Sure, warriors, but not families and so on. And so we have perfected an ability to Pontius Pilate ourselves out of responsibility for our historic influence on the world.
The other thing that we were able to hear and people believed was this is just Africa. This happens in Africa because it's all tribal. As though that was something that was an explanation.
The media, nobody was coming. And I was told nobody wants to come, nobody's interested in coming, you're there alone, and we're not even sure how you're going to get out. And however, the only ones that did come in, because the NGOs, it was too risky for them to come in, was the media. And as I often say to journalists for human rights, yeah, the media must be prepared to take casualties too, as they try to get those stories. So the media was there, and I realized that if nobody else was coming in, and I had absolutely no weapon left to be able to influence the situation, then maybe I can use the media as a weapon. And so I opened up my headquarters to all of them. And they knew everything that I was planning except a few particular operations. And they provided me information, I provided them with information, and it was them that I turned to shame the world to sending me capabilities. They were the only tool I saw left. The problem was, although the stories were getting out, and I had soldiers injured trying to get their stories from, in those days, the technology of the time, through to Uganda and then to Nairobi, ultimately to get to North America and around the world. Although the stories were getting out, and I was getting them stories every day, most of the stories ended up on the cutting floor in Atlanta, in New York, in Paris, in London, and Toronto, and so on, because the people who ran the networks and so on felt that information was just too difficult for us, society, to handle, and so they really minimized it. And ultimately, O.J. Simpson and Tanya Harding got more press than 1 million dead Rwandans and 4 million refugees and internally displaced, of which hundreds of thousands died of cholera because nothing was coming in. And we ended up with just under 500,000 orphans in a society that didn't even know what an orphan was, because there was always family there to take care of them. The upheaval that it created was off any scale.
And then just to think right now and to think of what's happening now, is what happened in Rwanda happening to the Rohingya, and is it the same thing?
The Rohingya, in Syria and a number of circumstances as they were targeting the Baha'is in Iran, I think that the pecking order still exists based on self-interest, on whether or not we intervene or assist or not. I think that the way we have evolved since Rwanda, on the one hand, we've created an international criminal court that is still young and immature and has got to still build its capacity, its jurisprudence. We created a concept called responsibility to protect that this country, in fact, led at the time. And Paul Martin's speech of September 2005 in the General Assembly is quite significant on that. And it says that it's not the state that's sovereign, it's the human being that's sovereign. Mm-hmm. And if human beings are massively abused, we have a responsibility, with or without the UN, to intervene and to protect them. The only problem is that none of the political leadership of the world has the ability to take that and use it. We didn't use it in Syria. We used the attempt at it in Libya. But really, I hold now more than I hold those in 94. And that's saying something, I guess. More culpable now of all the catastrophes that are going on, because we've got the information, we know how to anticipate it, and also we've got the tools to be able to not only stop these, but to prevent them. But there is no political will, nor courage, nor statesmanship that seems to be out there willing to risk it. And that is the great weakness right now of the world, is that there is no statesmanship who are humble, but also are capable of taking risky decisions, who are capable of standing up and influencing their nation. That, yeah, at times, whatever happens in the world, we are, as human beings, required to even be prepared to spill blood to help those who are being massively abused in their human rights. And so, if we continue to harass our politicians with stupidities about helicopters and other kinds of things, and don't get them into the hard subjects and start to make them treat us like adults and not like grade 9 children, as they're doing now, we're still going to end up with very myopic, provincial, in the most pejorative way possible, decisions by the political elites of the world. And that's the very, very redacted text that I'm using.
Thank you. C'était magnifique.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes.
Now that you've had your 2-minute stretch, please. I end my speeches, particularly in this country, by saying 2 things. One, it is a just time to serve, either in uniform or in NGOs and so on. But those who do serve, and particularly we see them in uniform, we have a responsibility to them, and that we should treat them with dignity and respect when we see the body bags and the injured come back. And in particular, they should not have to fight again, them and their families, to live decently as injured veterans in this country. Thank you very much.
Well, let me first simply say, on behalf of all of us, thank you to General Dallaire for your ethical strength and for the example you set us all. You're there for all of us. And I also want to say that there are many members of the Rwandan Canadian community here in the hall, along with Eloge, and we're very happy and moved that you're here for this important evening. We've just finished 2 days of 6 degrees, all day yesterday, and then last night Adam Gopnik gave the LaFontaine Baldwin lecture, and then all day today and tonight General Dallaire receiving the Global Citizenship Award. And this is the 4th annual 6 degrees in Toronto. We started it knowing that it was essential that there be a place where people could talk to each other in this way about immigration and refugees and citizenship, active, engaged citizenship, inclusion, not integration, inclusion, and belonging. And I don't know how many of you were there yesterday or today, but it's so interesting to see hundreds of people, 400 people, spending 2 days together, trying to figure out how to talk to each other, because it wasn't planned that they would be together. I mean, they didn't, you know, everybody knew somebody there, but most people didn't know very many people. And to learn how to act like a community, and to talk about these issues which are so desperately important in the world, because the rise of racism and hatred and desire to exclude people just keeps rising and rising, and there has to be a kind of energy to stop it and send it back before it does more damage. So all I can tell you, if you weren't there, was that a public conversation like that is a lot of work for everybody in the room. It's incredibly exhausting emotionally. It's very moving. It's incredibly surprising. You have absolutely no idea who's going to say what. And you're always, it's astonishing how often somebody you don't know anything about stands up and says something which changes the entire course of the debate and the discussion. So it was an incredibly successful 6 degrees. We're really learning how to do this discussion, and I want to really thank, on behalf of all of us, the 6 degrees staff who put it together under the leadership of the Senior Director of 6 degrees, David Leonard. I want to thank also Aisha Jara and Karen Chikalyuk and Roberto Alvarez, who led all of this. And as you know, last year, Charlie Foran retired as CEO, and we now have a new remarkable CEO, Yasser Naqvi, who came to Canada at the age of 15. His father had been in jail. He was a lawyer, and they decided the time had come to come and become Canadians. He arrived, Yasser, in Canada at the age of 15, and within about 20 years was a cabinet minister in Ontario, and until very recently was the Attorney General of Ontario, the Minister of Justice of Ontario. And I wonder if Yasser would come out on the stage and say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. And I want to start by thanking General Dallaire. Thank you for your service. Thank you for making me, at least, a very proud Canadian, and felt that somehow I'm associated and affiliated with you. I remember I had only been in Canada 6 years when the genocide took place, and weeping at that time, as many Canadians and people around the world did. And as a Canadian, I felt helpless, thinking that one of the big reasons that my parents decided to come to this country is to find ways to avoid those type of circumstances to take place. And it became almost part of a bit of a mission around public service as a result, to ensure that we make the right decisions. Fortunately, I did become part of those political elites as well, where you try to avoid some of those difficult decisions. But that highlights to me the work that we are doing through the Institute for Canadian Citizenship under the leadership of Adrienne Clarkson and John Rosten-Saul, is that we cannot no longer be apologetic about making the case for inclusion. That we have to be more bold and aggressive and abrasive to talk about that we as humans are one, and that we need to keep doing this work every single day. And so they're very small but mighty team at the offices of Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and many of them are here, and we're tremendously busy doing the 6 Degrees, which is the Global Forum for Inclusion, is to make that case. And we're trying to make that case not only just in Canada, but in other places in the world like Germany and Mexico as well. So, thank you. Yeah. So as the CEO, I won't be doing my job if I did not tell you that that work is not easy, as John said, and that work does require a lot of resources. So we need your help, we need your support to ensure that we keep doing this important work of growing this movement for inclusion that generates out of Canada, and we still have a lot of work to do in Canada. Just look at reconciliation with the Indigenous people. But let's keep doing this movement, let's keep growing this movement around the world. So I hope that we can count on your support as we grow 6 Degrees and the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and this global forum and the movement for inclusion. Thank you very much.
So, as Yasser has just said, after only 4 years, we're already doing 5 6 Degrees gatherings, events every year. And we're already talking about the 6th, which I think, anyway. And so this November 11th, we will be holding the inaugural 6 Degrees Mexico City. And we have a fantastic partner, principal partner in Mexico, the Fundación Reinventado a Mexico, which is the Reinventing Mexico Foundation, a really fantastic group. And their president, Javier Lopez Casarín, where are you, Javier? You're there, you're right there, is here, as is their executive director, Gilberto Hernandez. I don't know where Gilberto is. There he is. And it's very, very exciting, and we hope this is going to be an annual event in Mexico City. And there have been a number of Mexicans taking part in 6 Degrees here over the last few days. And then on February 18th, we'll be holding our 2nd annual 6 Degrees in Berlin. And it's really remarkable. Berlin, we feel, is the right place to put our core activities in Europe. And we have a number of partners. Many of them are here tonight. There's a big German delegation from all sorts of walks of life in Germany who are here and who've been taking part, who've been speaking, who've been debating, and so on. And then in March of next year, we'll be in Montreal for the inaugural Montreal 6 Degrees in French and in English. And then in April, we'll be in Calgary for the 3rd 6 Degrees. And then maybe by then we'll have decided on the 6th. I don't know. So this is, we call this a movement. These are not conferences. They do not resemble conferences. People come and they spend 2.5 days with us. It evolves, it rolls. At the end, it's not at all where it was in the beginning. I remember when Michael Sandel gave the LaFontaine Baldwin 2 years ago, he was going to give his lecture and leave the next day. And he came in for the beginning of it the next day, and he canceled his airplane and stayed for the whole thing. And then kept getting to his feet and intervening. And Adam Gopnik spoke last night. He's been here all the way through. It's a real discussion that leads to actions, we hope, very practical actions. And we really said last year, what are we doing? What is this? It's a movement. And we're building a movement, a coalition, national and international, with people who feel that we need to build these spaces of people who are not afraid, who do not live by fear, but who believe in inclusion, who believe in the possibility of people who appear to be very different living together with their complexities, happy because the tension that comes from those complexities can be positive in a way to build very strong societies. So we're thrilled with the way it's going. It's a lot of work, but we're very thrilled with it. And so thank you for being here. Thanks to those of you who have been with us for the last 2.5 days. And now I'd like to turn the stage back over to that remarkable man, Rufus Wainwright.
Faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on maybe there's a God above, and all I ever learned from love was how to shoot at someone who outdrew. It's not a cry you can hear at night, it's not somebody who's seen the light, it's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah,
Divine. Oh, divine. Thank you.
Well done.
So much.
Very nice.
Oh, so beautiful. Oh. Bye.